America pushed for an open Strait of Hormuz. That sounds simple, almost administrative. Keep the waterway open, keep the ships moving, keep the oil flowing, keep the world economy breathing. But look at the timing. Iran had just said it had closed the Strait of Hormuz again, and the world did not respond like this was empty theater. Shipping slowed. Traders watched. Gulf exporters adjusted. Diplomats rushed back into rooms where every sentence carried the weight of a missile warning. That is where the trap began. Because the question was never only whether Iran physically shut Hormuz like a gate across a harbor. That image is too simple, too clean, too comforting. The real question was more dangerous. Could Iran make the world behave as if Hormuz was closing, even while the United States publicly insisted that the strait remained open? That is the crack in the story. Reuters reported that shipping through the strait slowed sharply after Iran said it had shut Hormuz again. According to Kepler data cited by Reuters, only 5 ships moved through on Sunday, down from 26 the day before. Now pause there. 5 ships instead of 26 is not a speech. It is not propaganda. It is not a slogan printed by a state news agency. It is behavior. And behavior is the place where political theater becomes strategic pressure. A government can deny a claim. A military command can issue a statement. A diplomat can describe progress. But ship owners, insurers, oil traders, and port operators do not move because they like drama. They move because risk has entered the room. That is why this moment matters. Iran did not need to prove that it could seal Hormuz perfectly. It needed to prove that the possibility of closure was powerful enough to make the world hesitate. And for a moment it worked. But here is the part they do not want to explain. By reaching for Hormuz, Iran may have given Washington exactly the opening it needed. Not just to challenge Iran militarily, not just to challenge Iran diplomatically, but to challenge the very idea that Hormuz was Iran's private lever to pull whenever Tehran wanted concessions. That is the trap. America did not simply say Hormuz must remain open. America pushed the issue into the center of an international mechanism. Qatar and Pakistan stepped in as mediators. The talks moved through Switzerland. A 60-day roadmap appeared. Technical talks were scheduled. A communication channel for safe passage through Hormuz became part of the architecture. That is not a coincidence. A crisis that began as an Iranian pressure move started turning into a structured test of Iran's credibility. And once a threat becomes a test, the person making the threat can become the one under examination. Think of Hormuz as a narrow door in a burning building. Everyone needs that door. Oil exporters need it. Asian importers need it. LNG buyers need it. Shipping companies need it. The global economy needs it. Iran knows this. The United States knows this. That is why Hormuz has always been more than water. It is a pressure point on the body of the world economy. The International Energy Agency has estimated that roughly 20 million barrels a day of crude oil and petroleum products moved through Hormuz in 2025. That was about a quarter of global seaborne oil trade. Most of it moved toward Asia. Now add LNG. Qatar and the United Arab Emirates depend heavily on Hormuz for liquefied natural gas exports. The IEA has described Qatar's LNG exposure through the strait as overwhelming, and the same is true for the UAE. That means a Hormuz crisis is not just about gasoline prices. It is about electricity grids, factories, winter contracts, inflation expectations, and political anger in countries far from the Gulf. Follow the money, then follow the fear. Iran's move was designed to touch both. When Tehran linked Hormuz to Lebanon, it was trying to stretch the battlefield. The message was blunt. If Israel keeps striking Lebanon, if Hezbollah remains under pressure, if Washington cannot restrain its allies, then the world's energy artery becomes part of the punishment. That is strategic escalation by geography. The fighting may be in Lebanon. The pressure point is in the Gulf. The victims may be traders in Asia, refiners in Japan, industrial planners in South Korea, energy officials in India, and consumers who have never heard the name of the Swiss resort where diplomats met. This is how great power pressure works. It rarely stays where it begins. But Iran's logic had a weakness. AP reported that Israel and Hezbollah were not parties to the temporary U.S.-Iran arrangement. That matters more than it seems. Iran was attaching its Hormuz posture to the behavior of actors who were not fully controlled by the document being negotiated. That is not leverage without risk. That is leverage tied to a moving blade. If Israel continued operations in Lebanon, Iran could say Washington failed. If Hezbollah escalated, Washington could say Iran failed. If neither side accepted the rhythm of the U.S.-Iran talks, the entire mechanism could be held hostage by people outside the room. An agreement is not a wall, it is a bridge. And Iran placed explosives under that bridge by connecting Hormuz to Lebanon. Now look at the American response. CENTCOM said Iran does not control the Strait of Hormuz. It said commercial vessels were still flowing through the open strait. It said 55 commercial ships had passed through on June 20, carrying more than 17 million barrels of oil. That was not just a factual rebuttal. It was a sovereignty rebuttal. Washington was not merely saying the strait is open. Washington was saying Iran does not get to decide whether the world believes the strait is open. On a minus, that distinction is everything. Because in a crisis like this, control is not only measured by missiles, patrol boats, or mines. Control is measured by whose version of reality other actors obey. Iran wanted ship owners to hear Tehran first. America wanted ship owners to hear CENTCOM first. On a minus. And the market for a dangerous moment listened to both. This is where the official story begins to crack. If Hormuz was truly open without concern, why did shipping slow so sharply? If Iran truly controlled it, why did ships still move? If diplomacy was progressing, why did both sides speak as if the next mistake could turn into another strike? The answer is that Hormuz had entered a gray zone. Not open like normal. Not closed like war. Open enough for Washington to claim control. Dangerous enough for Iran to claim pressure. Unstable enough for traders to price fear. Ambiguous enough for every side to declare victory while quietly preparing for failure. That gray zone is where traps are built. I want you to understand the model here. Call it the ambiguity trap. In the ambiguity trap, a state does not need to take a full action. It only needs to create enough uncertainty that other actors begin paying the cost of the action before the action fully happens. Iran did not need to sink a tanker. It did not need to halt every vessel. It did not need to announce a formal naval blockade backed by transparent operations. It only needed to make the market ask, what if? What if insurance rates jump? What if a tanker is detained? What if one missile misfires? What if a captain switches off a transponder? What if a Gulf exporter cannot guarantee loading? What if a refinery misses delivery? That is how uncertainty becomes a weapon. But ambiguity cuts both ways. The same fog that helps Iran create fear also allows America to redefine the situation. If the strait is not fully closed, Washington can say Iran failed. If ships still pass, Washington can say the threat is exaggerated. If mediators create a communication line, Washington can say the crisis is being managed. And once that happens, Iran faces a choice. Escalate enough to prove the threat and risk military, diplomatic, and economic blowback. Or step back enough to preserve negotiations and risk looking trapped by America's demand for open passage. That is the narrow corridor Iran walked into. The public story was about oil. The deeper story was about control. Iran needed economic relief. Reuters reported that Tehran wanted other parts of the memorandum implemented before moving into the nuclear file. Those parts included releasing frozen assets, allowing oil exports, and creating space for economic development. That detail changes everything. Because a country that desperately needs oil waivers is playing a dangerous game when it threatens the waterway through which regional oil fear travels. Sanctions are not a wall. They are a slow tightening belt around the ribs of a state. Iran was trying to loosen that belt. It wanted room to breathe. It wanted cash. It wanted exports. It wanted the appearance of strategic dignity while negotiating economic necessity. So why threaten Hormuz? Because Hormuz is one of the few tools Iran has that can make powerful countries feel immediate pain. A frozen bank account can be ignored by the public. A technical nuclear discussion can be buried in diplomatic language. But a threat to Hormuz moves oil screens, shipping desks, and headlines. Hormuz is Iran's megaphone. But this time, the megaphone may have amplified Iran's vulnerability. The moment Tehran used Hormuz, the issue became too important to leave in Tehran's hands. Qatar and Pakistan, acting as mediators, described progress after the Lake Lucerne talks. The official statement referred to a high-level committee, technical negotiations, a 60-day roadmap, and a communication line to avoid incidents in Hormuz. That is the quiet turn. Iran tried to weaponize uncertainty. The mediators tried to institutionalize it. And institutionalizing a threat is one way of taking it away from the side that made it. Think of it like this. If someone threatens to set fire to a building, and the whole neighborhood then installs cameras, alarms, emergency routes, and a shared response team, the threat did not disappear. But the person making the threat no longer controls the panic alone. That is what Washington wanted. America pushed for open Hormuz not only because oil had to move. America pushed because an open Hormuz turns Iran's threat into a measurable scoreboard. Are ships moving? Are insurers returning? Are Gulf exporters loading? Are tanker counts recovering? Is Brent calming? Are technical talks continuing? Every one of those becomes a public test. And each public test limits Iran's ability to live inside ambiguity. Now look at Lebanon. Iran's decision to tie Hormuz to Lebanon made sense emotionally and politically. Hezbollah is part of Iran's regional network. Israel's actions in Lebanon touched Tehran's credibility. If Iran looked passive while Hezbollah came under pressure, it could look weak to allies and enemies alike. But geopolitics punishes emotional symmetry. The Strait of Hormuz is not southern Lebanon. A maritime choke point serving global energy markets is not the same kind of battlefield as a border conflict involving Israel and Hezbollah. When Iran tied them together, it expanded the crisis faster than it expanded its control. That is the mistake. A chess player can attack two squares at once, only if he can defend his own king. Iran attacked the energy square and the Lebanon square at the same time. But by doing so, it invited America, Gulf states, Asian importers, Qatar, Pakistan, Israel, and shipping markets onto the same board. That is not always leverage. On a minus. Sometimes that is crowding your own battlefield with actors who do not share your script. Reuters reported another revealing detail. Gulf producers such as Abu Dhabi National Oil Company and Kuwait Petroleum Corporation issued tenders allowing loading from inside or outside Hormuz. That is not panic in the cinematic sense. Nobody is screaming in a control room. But it is preparation. And preparation is evidence. Companies do not add logistical flexibility for poetry. They do it because uncertainty has become a cost. This is what made Iran's move powerful and dangerous for Iran at the same time. It proved that Hormuz fear still works. But it also proved that everyone else is willing to adapt around that fear. Once Gulf exporters start adjusting, once mediators build channels, once CENTCOM releases vessel numbers, once Reuters and AP track the contradiction between claims and movement, Iran loses part of the shadow space in which the threat operates. A threat is strongest when it lives in imagination. It weakens when everyone starts measuring it. That is why the number 5 matters. 5 ships through Hormuz on Sunday, according to Kepler data cited by Reuters, compared with 26 the day before. That number is dramatic enough to show fear, but it is not absolute enough to prove total closure. It gives Iran evidence that its threat matters. It gives America evidence that the strait is not sealed. It gives markets evidence that risk is real. It gives diplomats evidence that the crisis must be contained. 1 number, 4 meanings. That is the anatomy of a geopolitical trap. Now consider Trump's warning. Reuters reported that Trump threatened further attacks if Iran did not restrain Hezbollah and its allies. That warning sat beside American claims that diplomacy could continue. On the surface, that looks contradictory. Peace language on one side, military threat on the other. But in coercive diplomacy, contradiction is often the instrument. The message is negotiate or the alternative gets worse. This is not gentle diplomacy. It is a hand extended over a table while the other hand rests on a weapon. Iran had to respond without appearing intimidated. That is why the story about whether Iranian negotiators left the room matters. Iran suggested the U.S. threat disrupted the meeting. A U.S. diplomat said Iran never left, and that talks continued deep into the night through intermediaries. Both versions serve a purpose. Iran's version protects dignity. America's version protects momentum. The mediator's version protects the process. And the process itself may be the real battlefield. Because if talks continue, even after Hormuz threats, even after Trump warnings, even after Lebanon flares, then Iran's escalation did not break the table. It merely raised the price of sitting at it. And if the table survives, America can say pressure worked. That is the deeper trap. Iran wanted to show that without concessions there would be regional cost. America wanted to show that even under regional cost, Iran still had to negotiate. Both messages cannot fully win at the same time. But the 60-day roadmap tilts the image. It suggests Iran did not turn Hormuz into a final rupture. It turned Hormuz into a crisis that got absorbed into a diplomatic framework. Absorption is not victory in a headline. It is quieter, but strategically it can be devastating. When a threat is absorbed, it becomes a file. When it becomes a file, it becomes a subject for committees, technical talks, monitoring, and benchmarks. And when it becomes benchmarks, it stops being pure fear. It becomes homework. That is not what Tehran wanted. Now, to be fair, the strongest argument against this reading is serious. You could say Iran was not trapped at all. You could say Iran achieved exactly what it wanted. It made shipping slow. It forced Hormuz into the talks. It made mediators address safe passage. It reminded the world that Lebanon, sanctions, oil waivers, and maritime security cannot be separated. That argument is not foolish. In fact, intelligent people can believe it because the evidence supports part of it. Shipping did slow. Gulf exporters did adjust. The communication channel did appear. The 60-day roadmap did not ignore Hormuz. Iran's threat clearly moved the room. So the question is not whether Iran created pressure. It did. The question is whether Iran controlled the consequences of that pressure. And that is where the argument weakens. Because once the crisis became internationalized, Iran was no longer simply threatening Washington. It was pressuring Asian importers, Gulf exporters, LNG buyers, insurance markets, Qatar, Pakistan, and everyone whose economic stability depends on that narrow waterway. That creates backlash potential. Iran's leverage works because the world needs Hormuz. But the more the world needs Hormuz, the less patience the world has for any actor that appears to endanger it. That is the paradox. The same importance that makes Hormuz a powerful Iranian card also makes it too important for others to allow Iran to play casually. America understands this. That is why Washington framed the issue as freedom of navigation. That phrase is not just legal language. It is a coalition-building machine. It turns a U.S.-Iran dispute into a global commons problem. If Hormuz is merely a bilateral bargaining chip, Iran has room. If Hormuz is a global trade artery under threat, Iran becomes the problem. That is the transformation Washington wanted. The question is not what they said. The question is what they moved. The United States moved the narrative toward open passage. CENTCOM moved data into the public space. Qatar and Pakistan moved the crisis into a roadmap. Gulf companies moved logistics. Markets moved prices. Ship owners moved cautiously. Iran moved the threat. But the world moved to contain the threat. That is why Iran got trapped does not mean Iran lost everything. It means Iran's own tool began generating a counter-system around it. A trap in geopolitics rarely snaps shut all at once. It tightens. First, the threat creates attention. Then attention creates measurement. Then measurement creates benchmarks. Then benchmarks create accountability. Then accountability creates pressure on the side that introduced the risk. That is what could happen here. If shipping recovers, says Iran's closure failed. Slow, America says Iran is endangering global commerce. If Iran escalates, it risks military response and diplomatic isolation. If Iran retreats, it risks looking like it used Hormuz but could not sustain the threat. Every path carries a cost. That is a trap. But it is not a clean American victory either. This is important. The United States also faces risk. If Washington claims Hormuz is open while ships avoid it, American credibility takes a hit. If Trump threatens strikes and then avoids action after another Iranian move, deterrence looks weaker. If America pushes too hard, Iran may escalate just to prove it is not being humiliated. Coercion is a dangerous instrument because it has pride on both ends. The American strategy depends on keeping enough pressure to force discipline, but not so much pressure that Iran decides humiliation is worse than escalation. That is a thin line. And Lebanon makes it thinner. If Israel intensifies operations, Iran may feel compelled to reattach Hormuz to Lebanon again. If Hezbollah escalates, Washington may blame Tehran. If the Lebanese front flares while technical talks are ongoing, the 60-day roadmap may become less like a bridge and more like a rope over fire. This is why the next 48 to 72 hours matter. Not because one dramatic headline will explain everything. Because the real indicators will be behavioral. The first thing to watch is vessel movement through Hormuz. Do tanker counts recover toward normal levels, or does the slowdown continue? If the ships come back, Iran's threat loses force. If they do not, America's open Hormuz message becomes harder to defend. The second thing to watch is whether the communication line described by Qatar and Pakistan produces visible restraint. That means fewer contradictory claims, fewer maritime incidents, and more technical scheduling. If the line works, the threat is being absorbed. If it fails, the roadmap is mostly paper. The third thing to watch is Lebanon, not the speeches about Lebanon, but the military tempo. If Israeli operations and Hezbollah responses continue to escalate, Iran will have a ready excuse to keep pressure on Hormuz. If the tempo cools, Tehran may claim partial success and step back without admitting retreat. Those are the three signals. Ships. Channels. Lebanon. Everything else is noise unless it moves one of those. Now return to the title. America pushed for open Hormuz. Iran got trapped. The trap was not that Iran had no leverage. Iran had leverage. The trap was that using it forced the world to define, measure, and organize against that leverage. That is the difference between power and control. Power is the ability to make people afraid. Control is the ability to decide what happens after they become afraid. Iran showed power. America tried to seize control. And in the Strait of Hormuz, that distinction can move billions of dollars, millions of barrels, and the nerves of governments across 3 continents. The public may see this as another crisis headline. Iran threatens, America responds, diplomats meet, markets shake. But beneath the headline is a deeper pattern. On a plot, a country under sanctions reaches for a global choke point. A superpower turns that choke point into a test of order. Mediators transform the test into a roadmap. Markets expose the fear underneath the diplomatic language. Ships become votes. Oil barrels become signals. Silence becomes evidence. And the whole world watches a narrow strip of water as if it were a courtroom. Because in a way it is. Hormuz is where Iran's threat is being judged. It is where America's guarantee is being judged. It is where diplomacy is being judged. It is where energy markets are asking whether the world still has managers or only arsonists with talking points. That is why this moment is bigger than one maritime claim. If Iran can make the world fear a closure without actually closing the strait, then ambiguity becomes a weapon of statecraft. But if America can force that ambiguity into a monitored, measured international process, then the weapon becomes evidence against the person holding it. That is the chessboard now. Not a gate. Not a headline. A contest over who controls fear after fear has already been released. And maybe that is the most dangerous lesson of the Hormuz crisis. Modern power is not always about firing first. Sometimes it is about making everyone else calculate the possibility that you might. But once the world starts calculating you, it also starts building around you. Iran wanted to show that Hormuz could still shake the planet. It did. America wanted to show that Iran could not own that panic alone. That is the struggle now. And the question that remains is not whether the strait is open today. The question is more unsettling. When a country turns global fear into leverage, who really controls the next move? The country making the threat, or the world forced to organize against it?